Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Westmont Downtown Series, Conversations about Things That Matter. I'm Bobby Keaney, and I'm a member of the Westmont Foundation Board. It's the Foundation Board that sponsors the Westmont Downtown Series, which was begun in October 2005. The series highlights important topics of the day, and of course it highlights our amazing Westmont faculty. They're the ones that work hard and bring this information to you. The series is a gift to our community. The goal is for those who attend to enjoy meaningful and lively conversations. So there's time afterwards with lots of questions. And it's constructive dialogue, and everybody has opinions. I might add, there's nothing that is more interesting than new information and their perspective from those who study it. This is the first talk of our 2011-2012 series. There will be 3 more, one in November, February, and April. Please pick this up on your way out. They're on the table out there. This will give you details of the dates and who the other topics that we'll be discussing. I have the honor to introduce to you Professor or Dr. Rick Pointer. He is a graduate of Houghton College and earned his MA and PhD at the Johns Hopkins University. An American historian, Dr. Pointer joined Westmont's History Department in 1994 and was chosen Social Science Division Teacher of the Year in 1997 and 2003. I'm sorry, they can't hear me back there. He is acting provost for Westmont since 2009, which means he supervises the college academic program, including the budget, faculty development, and curriculum. Dr. Pointer has recently been selected as the first recipient of the newly established Fletcher Jones Foundation Endowed Chair in Social Science. I could continue with a lot more very interesting information, but he's very humble and says, let's get on with the discussions tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thanks for so many of you to come out on this evening. We are delighted, as Bobby just indicated, to begin this fall with such an important and exciting topic. When those of us who planned these events got together last spring, there was sort of a meeting of the minds right away that one of the topics we wanted to address in this year's series was the Arab Spring, and so we're just really delighted to be able to do that this evening. In fact, I was delighted at that moment to be able to tell the group that we were going to be in a position to have 2 newcomers to our Westmont and Santa Barbara community arriving this past summer who would be able to offer not just professional expertise but personal firsthand experience with what had transpired this past spring in Egypt. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce in just a moment Dr. Heather Keaney and her husband Jim Wright. I do want to echo Bobby's other words about the other lectures in our series. We're excited about the other topics that we'll be addressing. They widely cross the disciplines, from education to another session on sort of world events and global security in February as part of our President's Breakfast weekend. And then in, I believe it's April, to have a talk from Westmont English professor and the current poet laureate in Santa Barbara, Paul Willis. So a wonderful array of topics and perspectives, and we are delighted that you're here, and we hope you'll return for one or more of those. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers for this evening. Dr. Heather Keaney has joined us this fall as a new assistant professor of history. Heather is no stranger to Santa Barbara or to Westmont. She studied at Westmont and earned her BA in 1993 through the history department, and she went across town after Westmont to earn her PhD, first her MA and then her PhD in Middle East history at UCSB. which, by the way, has one of the finest programs in the country in Middle East history. Her research interests took her to Egypt, and there she has remained these past 10 years. In 2007, she became an assistant professor of history at the American University of Cairo, and she continued in that role and responsibility until this past summer. Her work at Westmont will include teaching courses in Middle Eastern, Islamic, and world history, as well as co-leading a new study abroad program that we are starting for our students this January in Istanbul. And she'll be co-leading that with her husband, Jim Wright. Jim comes to us as a Cambridge University trained lawyer. Jim spent his early career in Dubai and then moved to Cairo 18 years ago and has worked with 2 different law firms there, most recently for the last 5 years in an international law firm that he co-founded and has functioned as a senior partner with Egyptian partners in that place. He comes, as with Heather, with great expertise about life and political change in the contemporary Middle East, but also with a deep understanding of that part of the world's history. And so they bring together a wonderful expertise that we're just delighted to be able to share with the wider Santa Barbara community this evening. They also bring just a wonderful, humble, and gracious spirit to all that they do. And for that reason, I hope you'll have an opportunity to meet them and to interact with them and befriend them as they become, once again, in Heather's case and in Jim's case, a new Santa Barbara. They'll be speaking for roughly 30 to 40 minutes this evening, and then we'll open it up for a time of questions and answers, anticipating that we'll bring the evening to a close roughly at 6:45. If you do need to leave before that, we would just ask you to do so as quietly as possible. And when we do have the time for questions, because we have such a large audience this evening, we would love it if you could state your question very succinctly so that we can get in as many questions as possible during that Q&A time. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Heather Keaney and Mr. Jim Wright.
Come with us if you will. It's Friday, January the 28th, 2011, Cairo, Egypt. And Heather and I, at 1 p.m., are joining a large throng of Egyptians pouring out of the Mahmoud Mosque in downtown Cairo after Friday prayers, moving towards Tahrir Square on the day of anger, Yom al-Ghadab. And the crowd, as they move towards Tahrir Square, is shouting and chanting together. You might have just caught a glimpse of it there on that video. Ishab yurid asqat nizam. Ishab yurid asqat nizam. The people want the end of this regime.
There were men, women, children, families carrying banners, walking. The other thing they were shouting to people who are watching from balconies of their apartments is to come down, and those who come down will not die. I shouldn't have started with that video. But there was also this kind of family atmosphere. There were guys with trays selling pretzels, and older people. Anyways, you gotta go. I'll regroup.
The atmosphere was at once immensely serious, and yet also it was like a carnival, like a party. People of all ages, families with children, youth, men and women, just united in this remarkable and for Egyptians unprecedented display of protest against the regime. It was peaceful. People were walking, chanting, calling down neighbors from the streets to come and join. It was very good-humored, and yet at the same time deeply serious.
We were actually on the opposite side of the Nile from Tahrir Square, and so one of the goals was to meet at different bridges and then cross those bridges and try to join in Tahrir. But of course, that's where the security forces had set up their barricades. So we were blocked before we were able to cross the Nile, and that kind of became a standoff. So the crowd would push forward, and they would call people to push forward, and then there would be a barrage of tear gas canisters, and those who were in the front, it's incredibly incapacitating, would then fall back, regroup, there'd be a lull, and then another kind of swell to push forward to try to get across the bridge to show force and really join hands with people in Tahrir.
After several hours of this pushing back and forth, water cannon being used, tear gas, by the tens of thousands of state security troops and police against a peaceful crowd, but a crowd that was very determined to try to get across the river into Tahrir Square itself, it became clear to us that a kind of standoff had been reached. It was dusk was beginning to fall, and we were not sure how things would develop. We had no desire to be involved in anything violent. So we and the young Egyptian lawyer from my firm, Abdullah, who was with us, decided we would actually leave the area and return to our homes.
We had gone with Abdullah, and one of our reasons for participating in these demonstrations is that we had been encouraging our Egyptian friends to take action, and for some time, and it seemed a bit cheap to encourage them to do that and then not be willing to stand with them at the time. But we weren't interested in violence, so we left with Abdullah, but we hadn't thought about the fact that we had crossed the Nile, and every bridge across the Nile was now a similar confrontation, and we weren't able to get home. So we kept moving further and further outside of downtown Cairo to find a bridge that might be open. None were. We ended up being blocked from getting on one by the police, and then just as dusk was falling, the announcement came out on the radio that there was now a curfew in place at sunset. We didn't know what was going to happen under those circumstances, and at that moment, the police that were blocking the bridge disappeared. So we assumed that this was to allow people to go home, and we went up onto the bridge, again, trying to make our way back home. What we hadn't realized is that this is when the government had called all the police back to their barracks, hoping that chaos would ensue, and that there would then be a call to support the government to establish order. So we went up onto this bridge, which is a raised kind of ring road, just as the police had left, and it goes through a poorer area, and young men had come out onto this road, seeing this in a police state for the first time. There's no police anywhere, and this was a chance to go a little wild, and this is what we drove into.
So we're in the car, the three of us, and we're up on this raised bridge. It's a 4-lane bridge going in one direction, and the direction we're going in, we realize every 100 yards there were burning tires and young people with rocks and sticks and clubs, steel bars, and we thought that we were needed to try and sort of gun the car and get through these roadblocks. But as we tried to do that, we simply had large concrete slabs thrown through the windows of our car. So Heather's sitting in the back, and there's sort of glass pouring in on both sides. At which point we realized that gunning the car and trying to burst through the blocks was stupid. Yeah, professors. And in fact, what we needed to do was actually to engage with these young people. So I was volunteered to engage with the young people. And it was quite remarkable. As soon as they saw me leaning out the window and saying, "Can we pass?" in Arabic, they said, "You're foreigners. Of course. This is not against you. Absolutely. You can go ahead." So I spent the next couple of miles, every 100 yards, It's pitch black now. There are no police. If any of you have ever read Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities, you'll get a sense of what was happening. And I'm leaning out the window going, can we pass? Can we pass? And we're getting sort of way through. After a couple of kilometers, however, we find traffic in front of us is coming the wrong way back down the 4-lane road towards us, saying, there are shots ahead and it's really brutal. Don't go any further. So we swing around and go back now past the 10 roadblocks with me leaning out the window doing a regal wave and saying, can we pass, can we pass? And again, we're way through. We then drop down through the we drop down the on-ramp off the bridge into now completely deserted streets, deserted except for occasional burning cars that have been upended and set fire to in the middle of the roads, swing past the presidential palace and eventually get home to Heliopolis where we live. We give our young colleague Abdullah a bed for the night because he now has a car with 2 broken windows, which he can't lock, and there's a curfew. And the army have just taken to the streets. I think our title for tonight, The Arab Spring and Where Are the Swallows, has intrigued one or two of you. First, the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring is a journalistic invention. It's one of those catchy little words or titles, epithets, that communicate the fact that through the 22 countries that have Arabic as an official language, through the Middle Eastern area, these 22 countries, extraordinary seismic shifts of power have taken place, to some extent, in some of the countries. And it's spring because this sense of, after a winter, spring has the green shoots of new life and new change and new possibility. And yet at the same time, it's an awful piece of journalistic shorthand that flattens so many of the bumps and curls that make a proper understanding of each one of these countries impossible. So if you hear the Arab Spring, rejoice that it's this little shorthand, but bemoan the fact that it flattens all the bumps. And why the swallows? Well, in England, where we have weather, and seasons, a swallow... Okay, difficult for you and me. And swallows, a swallow typically indicates the onset of summer. So the sense of summer and, spring, which was full of potentiality, fructifies into the summer, which is actuality. And yet that transition from potentiality to actuality, has this happened? Is this happening? Will this happen? That's the subject of our subject tonight.
I think one of the things that also, again, it's a very catchy Arab Spring, but I think we would also need to be careful that these are not seasonal changes, but epical changes that we're looking at, or epic changes. And important, one way to kind of have some perspective on that is if you think back to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the toppling of the Shah was the result of 18 months of demonstration. Mubarak left after 18 days. So we're talking very rapid, but that's probably a false sense of how rapid change should be, will be, or even possibly can be. Yeah.
For those of you who've been on Arctic exploration for the last 10 months and actually don't really know what has happened, we thought it might be helpful to we give thanks and acknowledgement to the Guardian newspaper of Britain, which has got this rather wonderful, up-to-date, as of today, timeline which shows the different countries in the region and what's been happening. Can you explain the symbology?
Okay, sure. So, I mean, this is just to give you a sense. So the countries of the region are along the bottom, with Algeria on the left, with A, all the way over to Yemen on the far left. The green symbol represents a protest or a violent confrontation reaction by the government. The yellow, those will get a little bit bigger, is a political move. So usually a concession, usually too little, too late by a government. And you'll see eventually there's a blue symbol, which is an international act, either making a diplomatic comment on the events or actually getting involved, particularly in the case of Libya.
So things really kicked off with Tunisia. President Ben Ali had been president for almost 3 decades, a completely autocratic regime. And then on December 2010, a young man, university graduate in Tunisia called Mohamed Bouazizi, was unable to find work, and after repeated frustration in the job market, eventually started selling fruit and vegetables from a stall on the road. Until on the 19th of December, he was accosted by police, humiliated in the street for not having the requisite permit to sell 3 kilos of tomatoes from a cart. And he was so desolate at this experience of being unable to find work, and now even that simple means of feeding himself has been taken away, that Mohamed Bouazizi doused himself in petrol and set fire to himself and killed himself. But that was a catalytic action which has set off combustion throughout the region.
Demonstrations took place then in Tunisia, and you can see them kind of moving through January. And it was on the 16th of January, the president of Tunisia fled to Saudi Arabia. You can see then that was an inspiration to Egypt, which is here. And you can see the events take off. They started on the 25th of January because this was a brand new national holiday, Police Day, and declaring a national holiday in honor of the police, who are known for their corruption, demand for bribes, and torture. This was just seen as a bridge too far, insult to injury. And the fact that it was a national holiday meant nobody was at work or at school, so perfect occasion to come out and demonstrate. And that was the call that went out on the 25th. And again, you can see the events through December, January, concessions, string of concessions, again, all too little, too late, until on the 11th of February, Mubarak resigned. Oh, why did it do that? Go ahead.
In Yemen, Yemen has some major structural problems. 20 or so years ago, the north and south unified, but that unification, that reunification, has been deeply problematic. President Saleh, Abdullah Ali Saleh, has struggled to combat all kinds of sectarian problems, terrorism problems. The economy is ailing, and the country is extremely vulnerable to internal strife. And so I think you should be able to see how Yemen, fairly rapidly after the exemplars of Tunisia and Egypt, started to rise up, and there were very sizable popular demonstrations. And indeed, those demonstrations have continued, and so now 10 months or 8 months on, they're continuing. Abdullah Saleh has himself ended up in hospital in Saudi Arabia after being involved in a rocket attack and seriously injured. He is still currently in power, but severely weakened in every way. And we watch the situation in Yemen with great interest as to what will happen in that country.
So Syria also, again, which is in some ways the most stable, or could be considered one of the most stable areas, also started having demonstrations a little bit starting in March. You can see, we'll double back, but here's Syria. So you can see the amount of demonstrations, and those also are continuing until the present. And despite these demonstrations that are growing, expanding in size, and the number of cities that are involved, the government of Bashar al-Assad remains, so far as we can tell, well, it's at least in place. How secure it is another question.
Bahrain, one of the 6 countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council, in the main Arabian Gulf. I was in the United Arab Emirates in March and met with someone who had just that morning returned from Bahrain, where he'd met with well-placed Bahrainis, who admitted that Bahrain was actually invaded by Saudi Arabia. What happened was that there were protests in Bahrain. The ruler of Bahrain was confident that through discussion, negotiation, an amicable way of meeting enough of the demands of these protesters could be found. However, Bahrain is the only country in the Gulf which has a majority Shia population. Saudi Arabia, which is connected to Bahrain by a causeway, is extremely sensitive to the fact that the other major country in the region with a majority Shia population is Iran. And they saw Bahrain being a potential bridgehead for Iran, with its co-religionists, the Shia, to set up. So they gave the king of Bahrain an ultimatum. Put this down within the next 48 hours, or we will. He was unable to, so after 48 hours, Saudi Arabian tanks rolled in across the causeway into Bahrain. It was presented to the international community as Bahrain clamps down. Not quite true.
Jordan has also seen demonstrations, fewer, in part because the government of the king has been more responsive, making concessions, looking at what's going on around him, and trying to learn. So you could debate whether those concessions have been enough, but constitutional changes, shakeup of his parliament, shakeup of his cabinet, promising new elections, promising greater participation. And so far, things have not really kind of collated into a strong opposition force. I think in part there's not a sense of what the alternative would be. And again, as things around them turn increasingly violent, I think there's a sense to try to work within the system so far.
Morocco similarly saw significant popular pressure on the government. However, the king there remains very much loved by his people, and there was a fairly rapid acknowledgement by senior leadership in Morocco that change needed to happen. Constitutional change was put to a referendum, which was overwhelmingly voted or approved, and so Morocco seems currently to have dodged a bullet. The other countries of the Arabian Gulf, particularly Saudi Arabia, but in fact also the Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman, have all the ruling elites remain firmly in place. The responses tended to be to throw a large amount of money at the problem. And so enormous cash payments were made by the rulers, especially in Saudi Arabia, which ironically, of course, is benefiting very significantly from the instability in the region because it's doubled the oil price. But apart from significant cash handouts in Saudi Arabia, we understand that some women have had some unexpected driving practice. But really, there's not a great, strong sense of obvious, overt change, although we suspect that in each of these countries, there's a lot of serious talking behind the scenes.
And then the last country we want to mention, of course, is here in the middle. And again, you can get that's Libya. And you can see, again, starting in February, so the government of Tunisia has fallen, the government of Egypt has fallen. These are Libya's neighbors on either side. And so this is inspiring the Libyans that they too can see regime change. And again, this is all Libya. So protests, international action, concession, international action, protest, protest, action, action. And it continues all the way through and on and on. And again, through the summer. The other country here that's getting all the attention is Syria. So again, Syria heats up, Libya heats up, and again, continues calm for the heat of summer. And again, this is Syria and Libya. Interesting that Libya has been getting so much attention and Syria not so much. We could ask questions as to why. If you look at the amount of activity and protests that are taking place in the countries. Obviously, Libya has international, NATO got involved in a military way, in which they have so far refused to do in Syria. And that was clearly decisive, even though there are no troops, international troops on the ground or NATO troops on the ground. Their air support clearly has been decisive. And again, ending with the death of Gaddafi this morning. And so Libya is, again, a different case from all the other countries. Started as a rising up in the east of the country. Libya is very tribal in a way that Egypt isn't, or a way that Tunisia is not. And so it remains to be seen what happens in Libya if these without Gaddafi, as these tribal elements and alliances, which really in many ways align the country along an east and west camp, how those will manifest themselves.
Yes, for those of you who haven't heard the news from Libya early this morning, Muammar Gaddafi was killed this morning, and it seems that at least one of his other sons was also killed, which does seem to represent a decisive change after he had ruled for 42 years with what seems to have been an iron grip. And again, this is an extraordinary day for Libyan people. And we really hope and pray for them that they will now manage the much more difficult task of transitioning from a despotism to a functioning and democratic country in which all of their citizens feel some sense of ownership. Okay, that was our romp through the various countries in the region. Many apologies. Every one of them could have justified several presentations. We're going to focus on Egypt for the next few minutes, really for a couple of reasons. First of all, because in so many ways, Egypt is the motherlode for the Arab world. Historically, culturally, religiously, linguistically, musically, in terms of its media, Egypt does set the pace and is a leader, a regional leader. Second, because as Rick suggested earlier, that's where we have spent collectively the past 30 years, and so we perhaps understand Egypt rather better than we do the other countries in the Middle East. And third, simply because, after all, Egypt, you'll have to admit, is more interesting than Kuwait.
I think we also want to do justice or acknowledge the diversity of each country. As we hinted at, there are tribal elements in some countries and not in others. There's a unique dynamic in each place. And again, some of the limitations of terms like the Arab Spring, I think, cover a lot. Egypt is what we know. Not only did we participate in the demonstrations on the 28th, the Day of Anger, which was really seen as kind of building off the first demonstrations on the 25th, but we continued to be in Egypt. We only left this summer. So the day after this, when we managed to get home, the next day, what do? We decided to go to Starbucks. So everything else is closed. It's Saturday. Starbucks, of course, was closed. I think they must have a policy. When there's unrest, American companies shut their doors. But we went to another coffee house, but it was just really amazing. Egyptians, part of being in a police state, Egyptians have not talked about politics. You don't talk about it. You talk about anything else. And every sidewalk is lined with chairs outside of coffee houses. Everybody's reading the paper. Everybody is discussing what happened the night before. I mean, there have been small protests before, but never where they've built momentum as they had seen over these previous days in Egypt and what's going to happen next. It's while we were there chatting with people and chatting amongst ourselves that the word came out that the curfew had been moved up from sunset to 2 p.m. So everybody then made a mad dash to get home, run on grocery stores and pharmacies and sharing taxis and trying to get home. That was also the night that they realized that the government had allowed, had opened prisons and had encouraged thuggery because they wanted people to be afraid and stay home and protect their possessions. So this was a dawning awareness. And so that evening you had young men from the neighborhood coming around, banging sticks or cans together, calling for all the men in the apartment building to come down and defend the neighborhood. So these neighborhood watch groups were set up where they would block the entrances to neighborhoods and, again, do a community watch that went through the night. And this continued for the next 2 weeks. So every neighborhood had its neighborhood watch. They had ways of signaling to each other if an unknown car was coming into the area, taking shifts, women bringing down coffee and tea and goodies. And this happened in our neighborhood. All businesses were shut for the next week. So Jim and I were home, going for a walk in the afternoon, watching the news in spurts. All of our Egyptian friends were watching it 24/7, participating in demonstrations. Jim and I were very keen to participate and be supportive of our Egyptian friends. There were several times when we discussed going to Tahrir, but every time we wanted to go, we were going to go with Egyptian friends. And at this point, the government was starting to say this was foreign instigators. An outside hand was doing this. Good Egyptians would never rise up against their government. So there was concern that if we went, all it would take is one Egyptian television channel to catch an image of a foreigner, and that would be able to be used against the demonstrators. So we were encouraged to stay home. This was very difficult for me as a historian. These are historic times. But we felt as guests in the country, we needed to defer to what our hosts requested of us. So we were home and spent a lot of time on the phone trying to call and give support and speak calm and reassurance to our friends who were either home and afraid or pinned down in Tahrir. This continued until, the 11th when Mubarak did leave. We can talk more about the shenanigans that went on that day, but we got a call from our good Egyptian friend, and we jumped in a taxi and went down to celebrate with him in the streets in front of the presidential palace. And it was a really wonderful experience with families out, kids on shoulders. We bought ice cream cones. Everybody around us was eating ice cream. And just celebrating and having a giant street party in front of the presidential palace.
To put this in context, Egypt has had a recognizable civilization for 7,000 years. The elections next month may be the first time they've ever had a fair election. What were the causes of this extraordinary change that for 30 years, Mohammed Hosni Mubarak had ruled Egypt, and yet, with all the levers of power at his disposal, within 17 days, he had been brought down by unarmed civilians. How did that happen? We think there are a number of structural causes and also some spontaneous causes. The first structural cause was really just the internal contradictions of a despotism. Perhaps to my shame, I didn't really realize how sclerotic the effect of a despotism is on ordinary civil life, on ordinary people. But the regime of Mubarak had every single means of ordinary participation in civic life under their control. There were no trade unions. The political party of which the president is a member, the National Democratic Party, won, quote unquote, more than 90% of the seats in the last election. So effectively there's no parliament. All terrestrial television is run by the state and serves as a mouthpiece for the state. Even student unions were infiltrated by state operatives. Every single possible expression of ordinary opinion and life was controlled. And ultimately, however, if a tiny number of people have all the power in their hands, there's an awful lot of people who really have nothing more to lose by overthrowing that tiny group of people. And I would say this was a primary driver in what happened in Egypt.
Just to illustrate the point in terms of the state TV, during the 2 weeks of demonstrations, state news television basically had a camera pointed at one of the bridges, which was either empty because cars couldn't get through the center of town, or it was in complete, 4 hours bumper to bumper traffic. The message being, these demonstrators are disrupting the country. They're keeping you from your jobs, without ever once showing Tahrir and showing that these demonstrators were now in the hundreds of thousands. It was very effective, or not so effective. I think another factor, I'm a firm believer that human beings, we have an ability to endure a lot, but raised expectations that are not met tend to set us off. And I think this is one of the things that we also see in Egypt. There had been, for the first time ever, contested presidential elections in 2005. They were a joke, but you had an option besides Mubarak or Mubarak. Also in the last parliamentary elections, there had been a move, there had before that been a sense that there would be greater freedom in parliament, more open elections, that there would be the ability for an opposition to really form. But in the last election, that clearly was not the case, and the country in many ways went backwards. So I think this sense that rather than moving towards greater democracy, the government was actually squeezing the country once again, led to a buildup of frustration that through process or through evolutionary change, it was not going to bring about the change that they wanted, and therefore they needed to try another tact.
There's also a tremendous amount of economic frustration in Egypt. 50% of the country lives on or below the official poverty line of $2 a day. But probably another 30% of the country has absolutely no reserves whatsoever. There's not a dollar left at the end of the month, not one. So 80% of the country are really hurting. And yet they were seeing that the quite significant GDP growth that Egypt has been chalking up each of the last 10 years was going to inflate the upper middle class and some parts of the middle class. So you have this rapidly growing gulf between the haves and have-nots, which many Egyptian commentators compared to the last days of the court of the king before the French Revolution. And Marie Antoinette's grotesque response when told the people have no bread, let them eat cake. And this terrible lack of understanding by those in power. So a very strong economic frustration.
I think another factor was there has been economic growth, and some have been benefiting quite a lot. We have Starbucks now in Cairo. But this growth of economic prosperity and ability to travel abroad was not then being translated into political opportunity. So people are being more exposed to different ideas. They're seeing other ways of living. They have more invested in the country, and yet they have no greater say in what happens in the country. So I think this was a key force also in the revolution. This was a social class that also was exposed to social media. Social media played a huge role in the revolution. The fact that you could communicate by Facebook pages. A particularly important one was We Are All Khaled Said. Khaled Said had been arrested in Alexandria in the summer and tortured to death, and his mutilated body returned to his family. These images circulated on the internet, and Wa'el Ghanim, the Google representative in the Arab world, took this and created a Facebook page called We Are All Khaled Said. And this was the catalyst for the demonstrations on the 25th. And what Facebook allowed people to do is to say, we're going to have a demonstration. Are you going to come? And people could say, yes, we're going to come. And you could look on the Facebook page and see 100,000 people have said they're going. This completely changes revolutionary activity where you don't have to risk anything. You can see what's happening and decide to participate, rather than have to make the call, I've got to go down and see who's there and how many people are there. I've got to actually stick my neck out. You could have a good sense of who was going to be there and that numbers were on your side. So this, I think, is one of the key things that helped things move so quickly. Also, Twitter was hugely effective. The government shut down all internet and communications for 2 days. But when those were brought back, through Twitter, you were able to say, we're here, this is happening, go here, go there. Also from Tunisia, they were given directions on how to fight tear gas. Apparently vinegar and Pepsi are very effective. So people had these at demonstrations. So this circulating of knowledge. There were also pamphlets circulating about civic disobedience and civic action and keeping it nonviolent. And these were being read and circulated about what do you do, how do you handle this situation. So again, the role of this social media helped things move very quickly and gave people a clearer sense that numbers were on their side.
So those are the four structural reasons. This sense of civil frustration at absolute control by the regime of Mubarak, the political frustration that nothing seemed to be changed, and indeed the last election was even more brazenly stolen than any previous one had been, the economic exclusion, and the fact that you can now generate a large number of people with a lot more information than had hitherto been possible before social media. Some more spontaneous causes. The first one was simply Tunisia was a precedent. You have to remember, nobody in the Middle East had even seen an example of a revolution against another Arab leader in recent living memory. There were no precedents. There's no playbook. And then suddenly we're seeing a rapid, peaceful, successful, popular revolution in Tunisia.
How about Iran?
Well, he said Arab world. Iran is not Arab, I think is what he meant. We're not discounting Iran. No. Sorry.
So then you have so the precedent of Tunisia, what about us? Why can't we do what Tunisia has done?
I think also, again, this idea of in Egypt calling a national holiday for the police was just seen as proof positive that the regime is completely out of touch with the people, that they could even dare to pull something off for an apparatus of the national security, which is universally despised.
Third Mubarak was 82 years old. He's got cancer, so his health is failing. And frankly, he muffed the succession issue. Egyptians were absolutely incensed that his son, Gamal, was patently being groomed to take over the presidency. They don't mind rigged elections, but we don't want a monarchy.
And again, I think another thing is after these, there have been demonstrations in the past, but they're usually overwhelmingly outnumbered by state security or plainclothes thugs who are brought out by the government, and they quickly dissipate. One of the things that happened this time is, again, not only are numbers there, but this breaking through of the fear barrier. We have been tear gassed, we have been shot at, and we are going out again. What more can they do to us? And this kind of facing that fear, I think, was hugely significant and allowed the momentum to continue and the demonstrations to build. The government also made some really strategic mistakes, cracking down when they should have made concessions, making concessions that showed that they were weak and we could push further. You could give a whole anatomy of those 2 weeks of what not to do when you're a government. I think the other thing, though, is this idea of revolutions are unthinkable until they happen. And there's this mysterious moment of when does the unthinkable become thinkable. And I don't think that's something that you can analyze or dissect psychologically. But there was a moment in those 2 weeks where the unthinkable became thinkable, and then it becomes reality.
So those are some of the causes. What are the consequences? Now, frankly, as to what happens next, if we knew that, we wouldn't be professors, we would be oil futures traders. And I also have to say that our own analytical powers were tested and found sorely wanting. Every evening, as Heather was saying, we would come back and from wherever we'd been at work or we'd been with friends, we'd be talking to people, we'd come back and this sort of feverish sharing of information and, oh, do you see that's happened? Well, it's very obvious now, the trend is this way, or it's going to go that way. And every morning we'd say, well, we got that wrong, didn't we? So anyway, with that very significant caveat, let's essay a few possible consequences or outcomes or what might happen next.
I think another point to keep in mind in terms of, we make these kind of suggestions with a lot of hesitation. Again, no one, even after Tunisia, no one predicted anything would happen in Egypt. And days before, informed observers, journalists, academics were writing about how Tunisia was a unique situation and how Egypt was different, and that wouldn't happen here. So again, even people who know a lot get it wrong. So we're very much aware of that. So these are some kind of hesitant comments on where, again, areas to watch, things to be looking for as you follow the news.
And the first of these is simply, will the military genuinely go back to barracks and genuinely hand over power to civilian rulers, or will they merely appear to do so? The Egyptian military is greatly respected. Its status was enhanced during the revolution because they did not turn on protesters. We believe, it's still, the truth is still perhaps to emerge, but we believe that at the highest levels, orders were given to the army in Tahrir Square to actually open fire in the full knowledge that thousands and thousands of civilians would be killed when that happened. But the army officers refused. And one of the reasons they refused is because their cousins, friends, and neighbors were in Tahrir Square. They would have been killed. And they simply were not willing to do that, to prop up an ailing regime. So they refused. However, will the army really go back to barracks? There's never been a civilian president of Egypt. So we wait and see. That's a big one to watch for.
The other big question, of course, is what will the composition of a parliament be? Egypt doesn't have much experience with real political parties, with the possibility for real opposition. There's not a culture of loyal opposition that you can disagree but still be patriotic and still want the best for the country. To criticize the country is a criminal act. So there are real challenges there. Also, the party that has the most experience in terms of organization and cohesion is the Muslim Brotherhood. Other liberal or secular parties are having to work very quickly to try to catch up in terms of organizing a platform, getting the word out to the countryside, which is poor, rural, and with large numbers of illiteracy. So how they can communicate their concerns for individual rights and personal freedoms remains to be seen. It's also not clear that these same liberal elite are even really ready to go to the villages of Upper Egypt to communicate their message. It's much more fun to camp out in Tahrir. So I think there are real challenges there. So far as we can tell, it seems that we're not expecting the kind of thuggery that has surrounded the sham elections of the past, where government employees are bussed in, being told what to vote for. Everybody else is kept away by armed thugs. We expect them to be free and fair, but again, what emerges even from that are going to be political parties that are very untested and are very unsure, I think, themselves of what exactly they want or how to achieve it. I think closely related to that, of course, is the new parliament is going to have the responsibility of writing a constitution. Constitutions are important. I think one of the main concerns or questions is, will this democracy be majoritarian or pluralist? I think most Egyptians have the sense that democracy means the will of the majority, and therefore if this is what the majority wants, then that's it, we've arrived, rather than having a maybe more developed sense about the need of protecting the rights of minorities at heart. And it's much easier to make an example by sacrificing Copts, which are the Christians of Egypt, than by running over Muslims. And sadly, they were proved right. The popular outcry about what happened to the Christians and how they were attacked by the military has been fairly muted. And this, I think, is very worrying. And there's been an element of making the victims somehow responsible for what happened to them or blaming them for what happened. And that, I think, is a worrying sign.
So our time has gone. I think in conclusion, just to say, if we had to say what was the most important driver, certainly within Egypt, for the revolution, it seems unquestionably to us a search for dignity. Because ultimately, the Egyptian people felt they were not treated with any dignity by their own rulers and leaders. And this was a massive, angry outburst at that treatment. We, Heather and I, feel totally sympathetic to that cry. We very much support and applaud the Egyptian people for what they're trying to do or have tried to do. We recognize the huge roadblocks still in front of them. Revolutions are non-linear processes. There are all kinds of enormous challenges. I mean, Britain has had some form of democracy for 400 years, and we're still not very good at it. So the chances of taking a country that has never, ever experienced democracy and expecting them to make a great job of it in 6 months, that's hilarious. We've got to be in this for the long term. We've got to be patient. The Egyptians certainly, if they need anything, they don't need our cynicism. And indeed, Heather and I ultimately do take real comfort from the fact that God has said and promised, "Blessed be Egypt, my people." And we want to rub his ear and remind him of that promise in these days. Thank you.